In this video, we're going to go through an introduction to pivot tables. Pivot tables are easily the most powerful function in Excel. Yeah, they're that good. The results that can be achieved with pivot tables mirror what can be achieved in formulas, but you can do the same result in seconds rather than minutes. So what is a pivot table? A pivot table effectively takes a data source that must be in list format and makes it into summarized data. So what do we mean by data in list format and data in a summarized format? Well, this, for example, is in list format. It is a number of transactions that occur at different times by different people. It is a transaction by transaction information. Each row is a separate record. If we take a look at some summarized data, this is a very different structure. For one, we have fields on our rows and fields across our columns. The data that we are seeing within the table is a summary of other data. And the information within the table is a summary of list data. So this value here of 140 does not represent a single record. It represents the amalgamation of one or many records. So pivot tables are going to allow us to move from this data structure to a summarized data structure, effectively enabling us to look at things like sum totals, averages, minimums, maximums, etc. So let's start off by creating a pivot table. To create a pivot table, I move to the Insert tab and go to Insert Pivot Table. We can also use Excel's Recommended Pivot Table option. This is a new facility available in Excel 2013. But to start with, I'm just going to use a standard pivot table and I'm going to build it manually myself. When I click on Pivot Table, Excel should automatically recognize the dimensions of the table that I'm working with. And we can see the marching ants delimiting the area that I'm going to work with. Once my data is selected, I just need to decide whether I'm going to create a new worksheet or apply this new pivot table to an existing worksheet. To keep things clean and nice and simple, I'm going to create a new worksheet. So I just click OK. From here, what we will see in the pivot table field chooser is all the different fields that we can work with. Now, typically we will have two different types of fields. Those are category fields or value fields. Category fields will be things that are typically expressed as text, and value fields will be things that are typically displayed as numbers. So for example, my sales rep is going to be a category, whereas my units or total sales will be a value. My category fields, such as sales rep or region, should be added to the columns or the rows of the table, and any values will be added to the values section. To start building my pivot table, I have two options. I can either drag a field from the list and add it to the rows or the columns, or I can simply click. Once the field is selected, Excel will automatically add it to the row section. So I'm now going to summarize my data by sales rep. Okay, what might be a unit or a value that I'm interested in summarizing? Well, let's just keep it simple and find out the total sales. Again, I could just click on the tick box and Excel would recognize that the data is values and add it to the values section, or I can manually drag it in myself. What Excel has now done is that it has automatically performed a sum of the totals column. So I'm now able to instantly see all sales made by Gill, Howard, Jones, Kivel, etc. This would have been equivalent to perhaps doing various filter operations on my original list and making a note of the sum total for each one of these people. But using the pivot table, I can quickly and easily get a sum total summary for all of those sales reps. But I can also start to add more category fields. So I can now see the volume of sales made by each sales rep, but I don't know what region those sales have been made in. So I can add region to my pivot table. To keep the format of the table clean, I'm going to add this new category to the columns area. My data is now summarized by two categories, or some might call it two dimensions. I'm able to see my sum total expressed in terms of the different regions and also by the different sales reps. So if I was to look at this value here, I can see that is the total sales made by Gill in the central region. And of course, if I just want to know only region information, I can just look at the sum total for all of those columns. Or similarly, if I want to see the original grouping by sales rep, I can look at this final grand totals column. One field that I've deliberately avoided in this demonstration so far is that of the date. A date is, one could argue, expressed as a number, but it also has properties similar to that of a category. I may want to group, for example, by year or month, but it is also a value. I can actually drop the sales day into either the values area or the rows area, but it's going to be most logical and most appropriate in most situations to add your date as a category. So that my pivot table doesn't get too crowded, I'm going to remove sales rep from the row area. To remove my sales rep from the row area, I can either click on this drop down and go to remove field, or I can grab the field and drag it out of this area here until it is back in the original field chooser area. In the place of the sales rep, I'm now going to add sales date. I can simply click on the button and Excel will add it to the rows. So I can now see all of my sales data broken down by region and by individual days. This is impressive, but the format of these dates is not particularly helpful. I'd prefer to see a much more summarized version. Effectively, I don't need to see the information based on individual days, I'd rather see it grouped by month. So to achieve this grouping, I'm going to right-click on the field that I'm interested in. I go to my group option, and from here Excel automatically recognizes that I'm dealing with a date. And it offers me various grouping options. So if my information was particularly fine or detailed, I might only be grouping by days or hours or even minutes. But in this situation, I'm happy to group by months. I can also group by quarters or years, and I can do it simultaneously. So if I want to add two levels of grouping at the same time, I need to hold down the Control key and click on the second form of categorization. For this demonstration, I'm just going to have one category, and that is months. I'll hold Control again and unselect years. We can also change the range of this date field, but I don't have any need to do that. I want to leave all dates selected. From here I can just click OK, and I'll see my grouping come into effect. Let's revisit this grouping and see what it would look like with year and month grouped. Again, I right-click, go to my group, and holding down the Control key, I'm going to add the years category. I click OK, and I can now see my data grouped by year and then by month, by year and then by month. I also have these little minus signs next to my highest field in the hierarchy. That basically means I can contract the data down so that I'm only showing years. If I wanted more granularity, I can click the plus button and expand out the data. As you can see, this is some pretty powerful summarization. It's very customizable. If I decide that I don't want to organize my data in this way, and I want to see dates along the top and regions along the side, it is as easy as simply swapping these fields around. If I no longer want to summarize the total sales, I can simply remove this field and add in a different measure such as units. Whenever I add a numerical field into the values section, Excel will always try to summarize it with a sum, but I don't have to leave that default pre-selected. I can change it to different options. I click on my drop-down menu and go to Value Field Settings. From this menu, I can then choose to summarize my data in different ways. For example, I might want to know the average number of units sold in the different regions for the different dates. And here I can see some variation. Some months seem to have had a higher average number of units. Perhaps a more useful measure would be the count. And now I can just see how many sales, individual transactions have been made on each date in each region. There's one area of the pivot table in this section that we haven't talked about, and that is filters. So similar to the way that we've applied filters to a simple list, we can also apply filters to an entire pivot table. Let's take our sales rep and add it as a filter. I grab my field and drop it into the filters section. From here, I can now see that sales rep appears at the top of my pivot table, with another drop-down. This drop-down is where I'm able to filter the data. I could either pick one specific salesperson, for example Howard, and all of my data would be filtered down to only show data relevant to Howard. Alternatively, I can activate this tick box, which will allow me to select more than one salesperson at the same time. All of my data is now relating to both Howard and Jones. It is also worth noting that I could keep adding more filters to this table. But for now, I'm just happy to have one filter based on my sales rep, so I can examine the performance of each sales rep over time. Pivot tables are not only a very powerful tool, but also quite a complex tool. So far in this video, we're only starting to get the basics of what pivot tables can do. There's much more advanced functionality that can be added. But having just the foundation level of understanding with pivot tables will be incredibly useful in your day-to-day work. In the next video, we're going to look at some of the most important settings within pivot tables.